in which an affair unfolds, and we see the damage wrought upon the scorned. Chapter 15. The shooting place was not far away, across a stream in a small aspen grove. Nearing the wood, Levine got out and led Oblonsky to the corner of a mossy and marshy clearing that was already free of snow. He himself went back to a double birch at the other end and, leaning his gun against the fork of a dry lower branch, took off his caftan, tightened his belt, and made sure he had freedom to move his arms. The old gray-haired Laska, who had followed behind him, carefully sat down facing him and pricked up her ears. The sun was setting behind the large forest, and in its light the little birches scattered among the aspens were distinctly outlined with their hanging branches and buds swollen to bursting. From a thicket in which there was still snow came the barely audible sound of water trickling in narrow, meandering streams. Small birds chirped and occasionally flew from tree to tree. In intervals of complete silence, one could hear the rustling of last year's leaves, stirred by the thawing ground and the growing grass. Imagine you can hear and see the grass grow, Levine said to himself, noticing the movement of a wet, slate-colored aspen leaf beside a spear of young grass. He stood, listened, and looked down at the wet, mossy ground, at the attentive Laska, and then at the sea of bare treetops of the forest spreading before him at the foot of the hill, and the fading sky streaked with white clouds. A hawk, unhurriedly flapping its wings, flew high over the distant forest. Another flew the same way in the same direction and disappeared. The birds chirped more loudly and busily in the thicket. An owl hooted not far away, and Laska gave a start, took several cautious steps, and, cocking her head, began to listen. From across the stream came the call of a cuckoo. It cuckooed twice in its usual call, then wheezed, hurried, and became confused. Imagine a cuckoo already, said Stepan Arkadyevich, coming out from behind a bush. Yes, I can hear, replied Levine, reluctantly breaking the silence of the forest with his voice, which he found disagreeable. It won't be long now. Stepan Arkadyevich's figure stepped back behind the bush, and Levine saw only the bright flame of a match, replaced at once by the red glow of a cigarette and blue smoke. Chick-chick, clicked the hammers of Stepan Arkadyevich's gun. And what's that cry? Asked Oblonsky, drawing Levine's attention to a drawn-out yelping, as of a frolicking colt whinnying in a high voice. Ah, don't you know? It's a male hare. Enough talk. Listen, they're coming, Levine almost cried out, cocking his gun. They heard a high, distant whistling, and 2 seconds later, in the usual rhythm so well known to hunters, a second, a third, and after the third whistle came a churring. Levine cast a glance right, left, and there before him in the dull blue sky, over the merging tender sprouts of the aspen tops, a flying bird appeared. It flew straight towards him, The close chirring sounds, like the measured ripping of taut fabric, were just above his ears. The bird's long beak and neck could already be seen, and just as Levin aimed, red lightning flashed from behind the bush where Oblonsky stood. The bird dropped like an arrow and again soared up. Lightning flashed again, and a clap was heard. Fluttering its wings as if trying to stay in the air, the bird paused, hung there for a moment, then plopped heavily to the marshy ground. "Could we have missed?" cried Stepan Arkadyevitch, who was unable to see on account of the smoke. "Here it is," said Levin, pointing at Laska, who, with one ear raised and the tip of her fluffy tail wagging on high, stepping slowly as if she wished to prolong the pleasure, and almost smiling, brought the dead bird to her master. "Well, I'm glad you got it," said Levin, at the same time already feeling envious that it was not he who had succeeded in shooting this woodcock. "A rotten miss with the right barrel," Stepan Arkadyevitch replied, loading the gun. "Shh! Here they come." Indeed, they heard a quick succession of piercing whistles. Two woodcock, playing and chasing each other and only whistling, not chirring, came flying right over the hunters' heads. 4 shots rang out, and, like swallows, the woodcock made a quick swerve and vanished from sight. The fowling was splendid. Stepan Arkadyevitch shot another 2 birds, and Levin 2, one of which could not be found. It was getting dark. Bright, silvery Venus, low in the west, was already shining with her tender gleam behind the birches, and high in the east the somber Arcturus already played its red fires. Overhead, Levin kept finding and losing the stars of the Great Bear. The woodcock had stopped flying, but Levin decided to wait longer until Venus, which he could see under a birch branch, rose above it, and the stars of the Great Bear showed clearly. Venus had already risen above the branch. The chariot of the Great Bear with its shaft was already quite visible in the dark blue sky, but he still waited. "Isn't it time?" said Stepan Arkadyevitch. It was quiet in the forest, and not a single bird moved. "Let's stay longer." "As you wish." They were now standing about 15 paces apart. "Stiva," Levin said suddenly and unexpectedly, "why don't you tell me whether your sister-in-law got married, or when she's going to?" Levin felt himself so firm and calm that he thought no answer could stir him, but he never expected what Stepan Arkadyevitch replied. "She wasn't and isn't thinking of getting married, but she's very ill and the doctors had sent her abroad. They even fear for her life." "What's that?" cried Levin. "Very ill? What's wrong with her? How did she—" While they were saying this, Laska, her ears pricked up, kept glancing at the sky and then reproachfully at them. "Found a fine time to talk," she thought, "and there's one coming. There it is, all right, they'll miss it," thought Laska. But just then both men heard the piercing whistle, which seemed to lash at their ears, and they suddenly seized their guns, and lightning flashed twice. 2 claps rang out simultaneously. The high-flying woodcock instantly folded its wings and fell into the thicket, bending the slender shoots. "That's excellent! We shared one," Levin cried out, and ran into the thicket with Laska to look for the woodcock. "Ah, yes. What was that unpleasant thing?" he recollected. "Yes, Kitty's sick. Nothing to be done. Very sorry," he thought. "Ah, she's found it. Good girl," he said, taking the warm bird out of Laska's mouth and putting it into the nearly full game bag. "I found it, Stiva," he cried. If you enjoy this format, please leave a like and subscribe and return tomorrow for the next chapter.